There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a woman through her 40s when she was, as a child, the only one. The only black girl in her class photo. The only one whose hair got touched without permission. The only one who learned, long before she had words for it, how to read a room before she was allowed to exist in it comfortably. That quiet doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up in loud moments. It shows up later, in a grocery store, in a work meeting, in the half-second pause before she decides which version of herself to bring into a space. She might not even notice it happening anymore. That is the strange part. What once took visible effort, calculating how to speak, how to sit, how much of herself to reveal in a given room, eventually became so automatic it stopped registering as effort at all. It simply became how she moved through the world. And that automation is exactly why so many of these women reach midlife before they ever stop to ask where the habit came from, or what it has quietly been costing them all along. Psychologists who study identity formation often talk about something called code switching, but that word barely covers what actually happens inside a child who spends her formative years being the exception in a room built for someone else's normal. It isn't just switching a voice or a vocabulary. It's learning two operating systems before the age of 10, and never fully trusting either one to be safe. Ask a woman who grew up this way what school felt like, and she will rarely start with the curriculum. She will start with a feeling. The feeling of being watched and unseen at the same time. Watched, because her presence was noticeable in a room where sameness was the unspoken rule. Unseen, because no one asked what that noticing cost her. She might describe herself as the good one, the well-behaved exception who worked twice as hard to be perceived as unthreatening, articulate, exceptional. Not because she wanted to be exceptional. Because she sensed, correctly, that ordinary would not be extended to her the way it was extended to everyone else. This is where the psychology becomes layered rather than simple. Because alongside the isolation, many of these women also received real advantages. Better resources. Wider exposure. Access to rooms their mothers and grandmothers were never allowed into. Some of them will tell you, honestly, that those schools gave them tools they still use today. Confidence in certain settings. Comfort navigating institutions that intimidate other people. It would be dishonest to pretend the experience was only wound. For some, it was also foundation. But foundations built on constant self-monitoring carry a hidden cost, and that cost tends to surface decades later, quietly, in ways that don't look like trauma from the outside. It looks like exhaustion that has no clear cause. It looks like being excellent at fitting in everywhere and belonging nowhere completely. It looks like a woman in her 40s sitting in a room full of people who love her, and still feeling, for half a second, like she is being evaluated. This is where nuance matters most, because it would be easy to flatten this into a simple story of harm. It isn't that simple. Plenty of women who grew up this way describe genuine friendships from those years, teachers who saw them clearly, moments of real belonging that had nothing to do with race at all. The psychological weight doesn't come from every interaction being negative. It comes from never being able to fully relax the internal monitoring, even in the good moments, even with people she trusted. The vigilance wasn't about any one person. It was about the room itself, and rooms don't announce when they've changed. There is a concept in psychology sometimes called double consciousness, the experience of seeing yourself simultaneously through your own eyes and through the eyes of a world that was never built with you in mind. It was named more than a century ago, but the women living through its modern version rarely use that language. They just say things like, "I always knew how I was being perceived. I never got to just be a kid." What makes this especially complicated is that many of these women grew up disconnected, even slightly, from the very community that shares their history. Not because they rejected it, but because geography and circumstance placed them somewhere else. They might have grown up without the specific cultural fluency their black peers had, the references, the rhythms, the unspoken shorthand of shared experience. So even returning to community as an adult can carry its own quiet ache, a sense of having to prove belonging on both sides. Too different for one room, not quite legible in the other. And that ache doesn't resolve neatly with age either. Some women find their way back to community gradually, through friendships, through motherhood, through deliberate effort to relearn what was never taught. Others find that the gap never fully closes, and they build a third space instead, one that borrows from both worlds without asking either one for full membership. Neither path is wrong. Both are simply what happens when belonging has to be built rather than inherited. This is not a story about victimhood, and it would be a disservice to present it that way. Many of these women built extraordinary lives. They became leaders, professionals, mothers who raised children with a clarity their own parents didn't have the language for. Resilience, in this context, isn't a cliché. It's measurable. It's the ability to hold contradiction without collapsing under it, to carry two worlds at once and still show up functional, often thriving, often generous with people who never had to carry anything similar. Resilience, though, is not the same as ease, and it would be a mistake to mistake one for the other. A woman can be remarkably capable, admired by everyone around her, and still carry an unspoken weariness that has nothing to do with her circumstances and everything to do with decades of translation work no one asked her to explain. That weariness rarely gets named correctly. It gets misdiagnosed as personality, as being reserved, as simply how she is. Few people think to ask whether it might be the residue of years spent reading rooms for danger that never announced itself directly. But resilience built on hypervigilance eventually asks for a reckoning. And that reckoning tends to arrive somewhere in the 40s, when the performance that once felt necessary for survival starts to feel unnecessary for peace. This is often the decade when these women begin asking a quieter, more dangerous question. Not who do I need to be in this room, but who am I when no one is watching? That question doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives in ordinary moments. A woman canceling a plan she would have forced herself into a decade earlier. A woman noticing she no longer softens her opinions to make someone else comfortable. A woman realizing she has spent 30 years being fluent in everyone else's comfort and almost nothing in her own. There is grief in that realization. And there is also relief. Grief for the child who had to learn strategy before she learned rest. Relief that the strategy is no longer required in the same way. Some women describe this stage of life as finally exhaling. Others describe it as mourning a version of themselves they never got to have, the unguarded one, the one who could have simply existed without translating herself for an audience. It would be inaccurate to say every woman who lived this experience processes it the same way. Some have made peace with both worlds and move between them with ease now, drawing from each without losing themselves in either. Others still carry tension, still feel the old instinct to perform competence before comfort. Neither response is a failure. Psychological integration isn't a finish line. It's closer to fluency, something practiced, something that improves with use but never becomes entirely automatic. There's also a quieter psychological shift happening beneath all of this, one that has less to do with race specifically and more to do with what happens to any person who spends decades performing for safety rather than acting from choice. The nervous system eventually starts asking for a different kind of life. Not a dramatic one. Just one with fewer rooms to manage and more rooms to simply exist in. That shift often gets mistaken for burnout, or for aging, or for losing ambition. It is usually none of those things. It is closer to a body and mind finally negotiating for rest after a very long shift. What tends to unite these women, regardless of how far along that path they are, is a growing refusal to apologize for the complexity of their own history. They stop trying to simplify themselves into a story that's easier for other people to digest. They stop explaining why they don't fit neatly into either box they were handed as children. And in that refusal, something quietly shifts. The exhaustion of constant translation starts to loosen its grip. There is also something worth saying about the daughters and granddaughters watching this generation of women now. Many of them are growing up in more integrated, more openly discussed environments, but the psychological inheritance doesn't disappear just because the language around it has improved. Children still absorb what their mothers model, even the parts left unspoken. A woman who has done the work of understanding her own history gives her daughter something rare, permission to belong fully without translation, without having to earn a version of ease that took her mother 40 years to find. Maybe that's the real psychological arc here. Not a woman healing from a wound, but a woman finally allowing herself to be whole without permission. Not asking to be understood by every room she walks into, but no longer needing that understanding to feel like herself. She was the only one in that classroom once. She spent decades learning how to be seen without being truly known. And somewhere in her 40s, without ceremony, without anyone applauding the moment, she stopped performing belonging and started simply being present. Not fixed. Not finished. Just finally, fully hers. That, more than any single memory from those early years, is what explains the quiet in her now. Not sadness. Not anger. Something steadier. The particular calm of a woman who no longer needs the room's approval to know exactly who she is.